Good afternoon and welcome to California Competes' webinar, a conversation about transforming an inequitable system to fuel opportunity with panelists Dr. Londe Ajose and Peter Taylor. I know these are trying times that just seem to get harder. As COVID-19 spreads across the state, its impact seems to intensify. Looking at just the impact on employment, last week, California's Employment Development Department reported that unemployment benefits reached about $50 billion since March and has processed over 8.7 million claims over the past 4.5 months, which is higher than the entire highest year of the Great Recession. Not to mention the way this crisis has touched our lives in a myriad of other ways. I appreciate those joining this webinar are thinking not only about how to address today's crisis, but also thinking about how we can make near-term changes that have long-term effects. To that end, data and these conversations are needed more than ever to ensure an equitable and inclusive recovery, build a system that's more resilient in the face of our next crisis, and more just every day. Some logistics before we get started. I will end this webinar with a Q&A session, so please submit your questions to the webinar via the questions feature. We'll be curating questions as they come in, and we'll try to get as many of them as possible during the Q&A session with the speakers. And as a heads up, this webinar is being recorded. We will share that recording with everyone who registered, along with posting it on our website. This webinar has three main components. First, I'll share some data on opportunity in California from our California Postsecondary to Prosperity dashboard, which launched today. Then we'll facilitate a conversation with our panelists. Finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A with your questions for the panelists. Enabling Californians to have a high quality of life, including economic and social factors, is an individual and public goal. Yet this opportunity is uneven across the state. Where you live and your demographic characteristics shape your likelihood of being able to thrive. Education, particularly higher education, has been seen as a key lever in promoting Californians' well-being and strengthening our economy and communities. However, advancing prosperity requires an understanding of who is flourishing and who is struggling. Data and analysis are not new to policy conversations, yet these conversations, while recognizing large systemic barriers, tend to focus narrowly on specific systems or specific populations. To more fully understand the state of opportunity in California, we must examine opportunity afforded from a wider range. To this end, in the California Postsecondary to Prosperity dashboard, we weave together data from 12 data sources to build an interactive website that allows you to examine post-secondary workforce and quality of life issues across the state through a variety of data visualizations. To reveal issues of equity, we compare metrics across regions, by race and ethnicity, by gender, and by income. These analyses begin to shine a spotlight on the state of opportunity in California and are the beginning of a conversation. To launch our conversation today, I'll use the dashboard to highlight a small set of findings. The dashboard has thousands of data points, and I invite you to examine them after the webinar. Now, I will pull up the dashboard to discuss opportunity across our state. The site is highly interactive and nearly everything you see can be clicked on for more information. This is the home page, where you can see a map of the 12 regions we used for our analysis. You can click on a region to be taken directly to that region's data. You can also download our full report, fact sheets on race and ethnicity, and our technical appendix, which details the data and variables we used and the metrics we created. On the homepage, we also provide a curated set of indicators of opportunity. Our dashboard starts with college access. Admissions to the UC and CSU require high school grads to complete a set of courses referred to as A to G courses. You see 49.9% of California's high school grads completed these courses. This varies dramatically across the state. Clicking on the icon presents this analysis visually. You can easily see that high school grads in our state's more urban regions are much more likely to complete the A to G courses required for admission to UC and the CSU. The other curated data on this homepage are percentages of students who complete high school grads that go on to college, adults who plan on pursuing post-secondary education, households that earn a living wage, Californians working more than 40 hours per week, Californians with health insurance, and California communities' average racial diversity score. You could click on any of these and see how these rates differ across the state. Well, let's dig in more on statewide statistics by clicking on the Click to See Statewide Data page. This page presents data across California's regions with various disaggregations, such as race and ethnicity and gender. The narrative here presents some high-level findings drawn from the visualizations shared below on this page. In a second, I'll walk through a handful of them. We also have related publications for download. All the publications that were on the homepage, plus a fact sheet with just statewide data. Let's look at post-secondary opportunity. Looking at educational attainment statewide, we found that 35.3% of Californians hold a bachelor's degree. This differs significantly across the state. When I hover over a bar, I can see the range regionally. Bay Area residents are the most likely to have a bachelor's degree at 52%, and San Joaquin residents are the least likely to at 17%. We also see dramatic differences by race and ethnicity. When I click on a bar, the data is disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, or whatever we could get our hands on. Asian Californians are the most likely to hold a bachelor's degree, and we see dramatic differences among Asian Californians. 79% of South Asian Californians hold a bachelor's, compared to 46% of Southeast Asian Californians. Even Southeast Asian Californians, however, are more than 3 times as likely to hold a bachelor's than Latinx Californians. While there are dramatic differences in the Latinx California community, the Latinx group most likely to hold a bachelor's, South American Californians, are still less likely to hold a bachelor's than even Southeast Asian Californians. Mexican Californians are least likely of all groups to hold a bachelor's at 12.5%. In this dashboard, we include a variety of metrics that assess post-secondary opportunity. I'll read through them and encourage you to explore after the webinar. We include, what does college access look like for high school students and where do they go? What's the availability of advanced college prep courses? How is college access for adults? And about colleges in the state. Given all the conversation about affirmative action and admissions at the University of California, I'd like to pause here. Where do students in the state go to college? Approximately 220,000 undergraduate students attend the UC. When I click on the UC portion of the circle, I can see some demographics on those students. Asian students make up a plurality of UC students at 68,000. UC reported to the U.S. Department of Education that they enrolled 321 students identified as Native American or Alaska Native. And while over 50,000 Latinx students attended a UC, this large number hides the fact that Latinx students are still underrepresented. The 53,877 Latinx students at the UC translates to 28% of UC undergrads. Compare that 28% to the Latinx population in California. Latinx residents make up 39% of the state's population and 48% of Californians aged 18 to 25, the age range of most UC undergrads. You may have heard the UC announce it admitted its largest share of Latinx students ever, 36%. While this is something to celebrate, we still have a ways to go if we want the UC to reflect California's diversity. We could spend this whole webinar on this, but let's keep moving. Our dashboard also includes data on student retention, transfer and completion, racial diversity of colleges, how many communities in the region are a university desert, what percent of graduates receive awards in high wage, high demand fields, and the programs that are most commonly completed in certificates, associate's degrees, and bachelor's degrees. Next, workforce. One of the key benefits of higher education is economic mobility, including improved workforce outcomes. We'll look at those. We examine how many people work and how much do they work, and how much do people earn. I'll pause here. California is known for its diversity, economic strength, beautiful coastline and mountains, and also its cost of living. For that reason, we didn't just include income, we also analyzed who earns a living wage, earnings that could support a family's needs based on their community's cost of living. We found that 64% of Californians earn a living wage, meaning over a third of Californians do not. This differs by region, and it's not just the urban areas where earning a living wage is tough. We can see this quickly by hovering over the bar. Central Sierra residents are most likely to earn a living wage at 70%, and those living in Imperial County are the least likely at 55%. We also see dramatic differences by race and ethnicity. I can see this disaggregation by clicking on the bar. White Californians are most likely to earn a living wage at 73%, and Native American or Alaska Native and Latinx Californians are least likely to, at 45 and 46% respectively. If you're interested in understanding racial differences by region, you can hover over a bar for a glimpse. Great. Finally, we examined prosperity. While it's impossible to quantify prosperity in a dashboard like this, we included markers that signify pathways to prosperity. We look at how well can residents thrive financially, including metrics related to housing affordability, a major issue in California. Let's look at home ownership. Home ownership is part of the American dream. It's a goal many public policies aim to advance because it improves individual, family, and community stability. And it's the primary way most Americans build and hold wealth, which in turn can be used to open doors and take advantage of life's opportunities. Across the state, about 55% of Californians own a home. This varies by region. Those in the Central Sierra region are most likely to own a home at 74%. Between this and the living wage metric, I'm wondering if more folks will be looking to move there now. Residents of Los Angeles, on the other hand, are least likely to own a home at 46%. We also see differences by race and ethnicity. If I click on the bar, it'll open. White Californians are most likely to own a home at 64%, compared to 33% of Black Californians. Other prosperity metrics included in the dashboard are what percent of residents rely on public assistance and have health insurance, how many minutes do residents spend commuting to work each way, and what are California communities' average racial diversity score, and what percent of communities lack access to essential businesses. The dashboard has thousands of data points, and again, I encourage you to explore. In our related report, we provide our thoughts on how to use the data to advance opportunity across the state, including engaging stakeholders and leadership in conversation, which I know we're all looking forward to doing in this webinar. So without further ado, I'm excited to move us to our discussion with Peter Taylor and Dr. Londe Ajosi. And I've noticed we had a number of people join us since we launched, and I wanted to make the announcement that if you have questions, please submit them via the questions feature. We're going to end our webinar today with some time with the questions from the attendees. So I'm happy to have us be joined by Dr. Ajosi and Peter Taylor. Dr. Ajosi is the Senior Policy Advisor for Higher Education for the Office of Governor Gavin Newsom, where she develops the governor's higher ed policy agenda. Prior to her appointment, she served as Executive Director of California Competes, leaving me very big shoes to fill. Her work in higher education began as an admissions officer at Vassar College, where she recruited students nationwide and oversaw student yield and the campus's transfer program. Dr. Ajosi oversaw statewide portfolios in workforce and civic engagement at the James Irvine Foundation, where she was a senior program officer. In 2014, Dr. Ajosi was appointed to the California Student Aid Commission by Governor Brown and served as chair for 2 years. I'm also excited to introduce Peter J. Taylor, who serves as the president of ECMC Foundation, where he led more than $165 million of investments and initiatives affecting higher education outcomes, especially among students from underserved populations. Before joining ECMC Foundation, he served as Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for the University of California System. He spent nearly 16 years in investment banking with Lehman Brothers and Barclays Capital, where he was Managing Director for West Coast Fixed Income Group. Mr. Taylor is an appointee of Governor Brown to the Board of Trustees for the CSU, serves on the board of College Futures Foundation, and has served on the boards of the Irvine Foundation, the J. Paul Getty Trust, and the Parsons Foundation. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So let's get this conversation started. As the dashboard shows, many Californians face limited access to higher education, from limited access to A to G courses to non-existent university options in the region to a higher education system designed to serve recent high school graduates. What do you see as the biggest challenges to improving Californians' ability to access and succeed in post-secondary education? I will send that question first to Dr. Ajose.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Des, for having me on this webinar. It's really exciting to participate, to see the fruition of this project, and to see California Competes continue to thrive with the support of your tremendous funds. I guess what I would say is there are a number of barriers, but for far too long, we've mostly focused on the question of access and less on the question of success and completion. And while we still need to pay attention to access, and particularly as your data showed, access for particular groups to particular segments, we also need to be very, very serious about completion. And the reason completion is so important is that if we don't have students moving through their academic coursework on pace, then it creates a logjam where other students can't get in. And so what we see is that the queue for those who want to enter higher education gets longer and longer and longer. And so really what we have been thinking about in the administration is how do we bring together our higher education systems to be increasingly coordinated around thinking about the pathways for students from K-12 to higher education, and oftentimes from the community college system to our four-year systems. And so we really want to focus on how we do that and to really bring an equity lens to that work. And by bringing an equity lens, it means that understanding that not every student needs the same things, that we need to tailor our programs and services to the actual needs of students when they get to our front doors in higher education, and understand that it's going to take different levels of resources for different students to be able to thrive in higher education. That's our responsibility. It's our moral imperative, and it's also good for the state's economic well-being.
Yeah. And Peter, given your leadership role at two of our systems of higher education and your role at ECMC Foundation looking nationally at higher ed, what do you see as a main challenge for post-secondary education in California?
Well, there are a few, and I have a funny feeling, Sujin, that I'm going to be saying, yeah, I agree with Londe a lot on this discussion, because she's absolutely right. For a long time, we were focusing on access and not focusing enough on success and graduation and completion. That's a major grant-making area for us now and will be well into the future. But I think if I had to call out two things that I would love to see us focus upon to improve outcomes, one is to be a little bit more holistic and broad-minded about what constitutes appropriate pathways for students. And in our view, including career technical education in that definition of post-secondary, as Londe said, not every student needs the same thing. We shouldn't automatically assume that every student should be shoehorned into a four-year experience when many of them want to pursue careers as skilled tradesmen and craftsmen and the like. That's just as valuable. And so making sure that those programs are easily available and readily available is critically important, and importantly that we support students in those discussions. Secondly, and I guess if I could wave a magic wand and fix one thing in the state of California, it would be to improve transfer pathways. We've made a lot of progress there. The associate degree for transfer program, I know sponsored by California, the Campaign for College Opportunity, and obviously at CSU, an important part of our deliberations, is terrific, but the process is too opaque and difficult to navigate for the community college student. And we need to make a lot of progress there if we're going to put ourselves in a position where outcomes especially for kids of color, are improved vis-a-vis where they have traditionally been. And then if I could actually add a third thing, in that definition of post-secondary, we need to do a better job, I think, focusing on the non-traditional student, or what I call the new traditional student. You know, the 27-year-old single parent, has to work part-time, has childcare challenges. The system isn't quite as adept at helping that student be successful as the 18-year-old coming straight out of high school can, you know, go full-time. So that's my nutshell for you, Sujan.
Great. And I'll rotate who goes first. So maybe sometimes Londe will be able to say, I echo.
Or maybe I'll just punt to Peter sooner.
No.
Great. So to sort of flip that question on its head, you know, we're in the middle of this incredible crisis. And so it's the challenges that feel insurmountable. I'd love to hear from you. What do you see are the sort of opportunities that California should seize in this moment to ensure all of Californians can thrive? And I'll throw that out to you first, Peter.
All right. Well, I'll throw out what I think is the, you know, an epiphany perhaps I've come to a little later than some people, and that's how can we ensure broadband access for all people, and really start to treat broadband access almost as a utility. We have certainly seen since the pandemic started, too many young people from low-income communities just don't have access to be able to continue their education by virtue of being in broadband deserts. And you know, as somebody who used to be a banker and used to work with electric utilities, it might be a shock to hear me say that I'm okay in favor of regulation of such entities. But I think the truth is we have to fix that if we're going to be in a position to help people both during the pandemic and then for whatever comes out of the recession 2-3 years down the road, continue to be able to thrive. I would also add two other points. One, on the post-secondary education system that is more comfortable with varied means of delivery, especially blended learning, I think is important going forward. We can certainly chat about hybrid models. And then thirdly, and Londe, you may not completely agree with this, but the opportunity to have higher education coordinating entity. When I was CFO for UC, I wasn't too crazy about that idea. Now that I'm a trustee of CSU, I see real value in somebody having an objective view about how higher education can meet the state's needs, separate and apart from the systems themselves. So those are the three things I think I'd throw out, Sujan, for us to focus on as we try to figure out our way out of the pandemic.
Great.
Can I pick up there?
Yes, please.
So a lot of actually what Peter says I think really rings true. I would start with the digital divide and the challenges that we have that we face in terms of connectivity in California homes. And what is abundantly clear as a result of this pandemic is that the inequities that we thought we faced are much more dramatic than anyone ever considered. We've heard a lot of conversation in the last couple of years about basic needs and food and housing insecurity. And I now add into that food, housing insecurity, and digital access, because what has become clear is that if you are a student in California and you would like to go to school this fall and you do not have digital access, you do not have access to education. I mean, it's plain and simple. And so we really have to think much more holistically about what it means to ensure equity for all students in terms of accessing higher education. In light of the challenges with the digital divide and the very real and immediate, the clear and present danger that we face as school starts next month for many students, the administration has been very focused on what we can do. Certainly, Superintendent Thurman has a whole effort and initiative around closing the digital divide, and we are working and partnering with him. In addition, the administration, through the task force on jobs and the economy, has taken up the issue of connectivity and the digital divide as a priority. And so we have kind of a four-pronged strategy that we are putting forward to try and address that. One is to work with internet service providers to get them to elevate their low-cost plans. Many of those plans are $10 to $15 a month for a fairly substantial amount of data and access. And so we're trying to get them to elevate those. We're trying to do that in a way that comes with a promise for how they will engage potential customers, that there won't be upselling, all of those kinds of things. So we're working with ISPs to bring them together so that there's a unified approach that they have towards California families. The second issue is going to be on the actual devices and the focus on the device infrastructure. Every California student will need access to an iPad or some kind of tablet or computer or laptop. So we're really trying to think about how do we get those in the hands of students in the near term? How do we work with our school districts to leverage the resources they receive from the CARES Act to make sure that every student has access to a computing device? Third is we're going to focus on the issue of adoption, that far too often many families don't understand the need for having that kind of broadband access. And so we're going to really work with our partners on the ISP side to make sure that we are pushing out the messaging around the need for folks to have access, not only for education, but for increasingly for telehealth, for job search, for working at home. There are lots of reasons now where, as Peter said, where computer access and broadband access is now a basic need. And then finally, we want to focus on what I'm calling utilization and support, which means just because you have the tools doesn't mean that you know how to get the most out of them. And so we really need to have a fundamental statewide approach to how do we support families in utilizing the technological access that we're trying to put in their homes in ways that are culturally sensitive, competent, and relevant, so that folks can understand, if I have this device and I have broadband access, what are the multitude of ways I can use it? What does it mean if my router goes down? Like, how do you really think about all of those things? And so we're looking at that four-pronged strategy and working with partners across the state to address it. One other thing I would just say about your question, Sujin, in terms of opportunities or silver linings. In the midst of a global pandemic, it's really hard to imagine what could exist on the other side. But what we do know is that at some point, whether that is in 12 months or 36 months, we are going to recover from this pandemic. We're going to recover from the twin crises of the pandemic and the economic recession. And that's before you even layer into that the huge racial reckoning that we're undergoing as a society. And when we recover from that, we need to ensure that we have a unified, cohesive, and coherent vision for what higher education ought to be and ought to look like. And so one of the things that we're doing in our office is convening a task force to think about what are the innovative approaches to trying to address equity as we recover from California's crises of the pandemic and the recession, and what can that look like, and how can we make sure that all of our higher education segments are on the same page around that? How can we do that in a way that is fundamentally focused on the student experience and student access and on equity for those students? So those are two things that I'm really holding out as silver linings. If we can come up with that blueprint and the buy-in from all of our higher education segments around that blueprint, and we solve the digital divide, I can quit government and go home.
We'll find something else for you to work on, don't worry. I do have a follow-up question to that, and thinking about this coherent vision for higher ed. And you began to outline some of what you see as the key components. I would love to understand, how do you hinted at the sort of buy-in, but how is the governor's office thinking about building that vision and then building that buy-in? How do you get, the huge higher ed system, both public and private, on board, if that's your goal, which is what I was reading into it?
Yeah, no, it is the goal. So the task force, we have numbers 19, and those names will be made public very soon. And we have really invited kind of 3 categories of folks to help us really think through how to articulate and develop that vision. The first are experts in the issue of higher education equity. Many of those people actually are from outside of the state of California. Some of them really focus on issues of policy, others focus on issues of higher education innovation, some focus on issues of data. And so we are bringing in a whole cadre of non-Californians to help shine a light on what are some of the things that we think we're doing well that maybe we're not doing well. One of the challenges we often have here in California, because we're so big and we are so innovative, is that we forget that there are things that we can learn from other places and other people. And so we see Peter's laughing because it's true. So we are bringing in a whole cadre of folks from across the nation to help think with us. The second piece is we have about a third of the group that comes from the higher education segments themselves. They represent both central offices as well as college presidents and college leaders who really help us to think about what's the crosswalk between a broad vision and the implementation that would be required at the system level to live out and live into that vision. So that's the second part. And then the third component are people who are stakeholders, if you will, from across the state of California. We didn't want this to only be the systems talking to one another. We wanted to make sure that we had lots of voices from people who were impacted by the system, who advocate on behalf of the students, who advocate on behalf of higher education as a whole. And so we have a number of people who represent the different segments and students and policy who are coming forward to really think with us about the equity question and what might be possible for higher education along those lines. So we're thinking that we have lovely philanthropic or consulting support thanks to the College Futures Foundation. And what we're kind of try to do is bring together those three groups of people to articulate and identify a vision that everyone buys into up front, so that when we emerge from this process, we're all rowing on the same boat in the same direction.
Great. Thank you. And Peter, in your response, you mentioned a higher ed coordinating entity, and then you hinted at sort of in your role as CFO at the University of California, and now your role as a trustee at the CSU, you sort of have a viewpoint of different perspectives on the value of a coordinating entity. I'm curious to hear sort of how you think we could get public higher ed on board with a vision led by the governor's office, perhaps with a coordinating entity, which one may think would be, if we had one, an entity that could take on this sort of challenge.
Sure. I think part of it is having real clarity on goals and objectives, and not a big, gigantic goal, but something that people kind of get their head around. And, to state the obvious, the governor's office and legislature also control funding. And if we're all in agreement about specific goals, let's talk about how we can tie funding to those. At the CSU, we've made, I think, a fair amount of progress, not enough, but a fair amount of progress on the graduation initiative that we launched several years ago. Governor Brown and Chancellor Tim White, and now Governor Newsom and the legislature have really bought into this idea that we need to improve completion and success. And they've put money in the budget very specifically focused for these initiatives. I think that's had a terrific impact. We ought to take those lessons learned and start to think about other ways that might be leveraged and duplicated. I'll give you a small example. I serve on a volunteer, Janet Napolitano pulled together a task force on African-American student experience and success at the University of California. All 10 campuses kind of thinking about how do we do a better job in UC to recruit students, and once they get in, to make sure that they stay in and they graduate. And lots of good feedback and lots of folks in the community on this little panel. But at our last meeting, last month, I think it was, we talked about, with the new incoming president, Michael Drake, what might we think about to improve pipeline of African-American students? And as a CSU trustee, I said, well, a lot of those things are also what CSU is doing. And there was really no way to kind of think about how do you get the systems together to kind of come up with a joint strategy around a very specific goal like that. That's one of the things that coordinating council could do, to say, hey, if the systems are going to think about how to engage alumni and donors and others, maybe we could do it together, as opposed to everybody kind of going off and doing their own thing. So yeah, look, when I was CFO, did I like people looking over my shoulder? No. But as a trustee, I realized sometimes an objective point of view, an engaging, friendly, objective point of view, trying to do what's right for the state is probably a good thing, and something I would welcome in my current position.
Can I respond to that? Because I think I actually don't disagree with any of those points, Peter. I think I would say a couple of things. Governor Newsom obviously is a trustee, even though he, right now is, handling a pandemic, he's a little busy. But I certainly participate or listen in and contribute when I can behind the scenes to many of the issues that are happening at the various systems. And I think the governor's point of view when it comes to a coordinating body is twofold. One is the first priority for our office this year was to really listen to the clarion call that came from many, many corners around the need for comprehensive data. and a data system. And so we put all of our energy in year one, and are continuing to do so this year, into trying to make sure that we have a statewide longitudinal data system that gives us the information that we need to know much more about the student experience, about the trajectory for students, about those pathways that Peter was mentioning. And so that we have always thought is kind of the fundamental piece that needs to undergird any kind of coordination that would occur. So I feel like we're at that place of really focusing in on how do we stand up that longitudinal data system. Secondly, the governor had already committed to and is excited by having this post-secondary council where he is bringing together all the public institutions, all of the leaders of those public institutions, and we're very much looking forward to having Dr. Drake with us next month. The AICCU, members of private industry, members of labor, and members from the administration to talk about what are the essential issues in higher education, how do we promote greater alignment, what can we do better together, what can we do that is innovative together, because it may be that over time, over the course of 20 years, the ways in which we envision higher education now will fundamentally change. And if that's the case, we have two choices. We can hold on tight to the way things are, or we can decide that we collectively want to get in front of it and try to chart a path forward that leverages the very best of all of California's higher education systems. And so that is what, in large part, the higher education, the Post-Secondary Education Council has been working on. Last year, we tried to stand up an innovative new project in Fresno. We got some money for it in the first budget. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic and our current budget situation, we have much less money for it, but it's really bringing to bear the UC, the CSU, community colleges, private institutions, and K-12. And I forgot to mention that also on the Post-Secondary Council is K-12, both the state board as well as CDE. We brought together all of those resources to think about how would you design education in ways that uphold the desire for a degree and link that degree to labor market opportunities and growth sectors of labor market opportunities in local regions. And we're starting with Fresno because the governor has a particular commitment to the San Joaquin Valley because of the high levels of poverty that exists there and because of who is poor there. And so we are really trying to think through, are there innovative ways as we step our toe into this issue of greater coordination and collaboration? How do we do that in a stepwise fashion that brings people along so that they are deeply committed and see the results and the possibilities of working together rather than it feeling like we're imposing upon them some kind of forced coordination?
Great. Thank you for that. And I can see some of the questions coming in, and I will prompt that there will be a question about the budget. So I'm going to push that off because I wanted to, but it ties in, I feel like, closely with what you're saying here, the incentives and the role of incentives around a lot of this work. I did want to wrap up sort of our facilitated conversation with a question related to change outside of California. So Londa, you'd mentioned bringing in experts who are focused on higher ed equity, that are experts outside of California, and what can we learn elsewhere. And I wanted to pose for both of you, is there an example or something you're interested in outside of California, or actually within California, where you see the kind of change that you'd like to see happening across California? And then thoughts of like, how could we advance that kind of change for our state, and who's involved?
Well,
I'll jump, Peter.
And I'll throw in a few examples. One here in California that we at our foundation have funded, the Pomona Regional Learning Collaborative, a coalition of 2-year and 4-year schools, Cal Poly Pomona, Laverne, Mount Sac Community College, and I think Citrus College, coming together to try to improve transfer pathways, among other outcomes. In Illinois, there's something called the Partnership for College Completion that I would encourage folks to look at. In Seattle, the United Way of Kings County. Here's an example of a third-party service provider very focused on helping college campuses offset, frankly, their capacity limits for addressing gaps in students' basic needs. And then lastly, an organization based in DC called Excelencia in Education. They have their Seal of Excelencia. A couple of California schools have earned that, but very focused on steps and tools that campuses can use to ensure Latinx student completion and success. those are few that kind of off the top of my head I would throw out as examples of successful programs that ideally would be replicated in California and beyond.
Yeah, those are all great programs. I think the two that I would mention in addition to that, I am really drawn to the ASAP program in New York. There's been a lot of research that's been done on that because it's really a comprehensive view of what it takes, not just inside the classroom, but outside the classroom to move kids and have them actually support all parts of their learning because you're paying attention to all parts of their life. And I think, it always has baffled me that oftentimes with recent high school graduates, when they're in high school, we provide them with all these supports and services and recognize that they may be on free and reduced lunch and they may have all of these needs, but suddenly over the course of 3 months, they go to college and suddenly they're supposed to have it all figured out. They're not supposed to be hungry. They're supposed to know how to find everything on their own. They're supposed to be completely grown up over the course of 12 weeks. And we know that that's not the case. And so I'm really drawn to the ASAP program because I think it really acknowledges that students come to college still in the midst of growth, oftentimes in the midst of poverty or trauma, and gives them the resources and the tools that they need to get on a good pathway to be successful. So I'm really drawn to that program. The other thing I really like is the University Innovation Partnership. I think they've done really extraordinary work at a wide cross-section, including UC Riverside, thinking about how do we think about equity and innovation on college campuses? How do we use data in ways that are really powerful to inform practice and to inform what students need? So I also hold that up. And then finally, I would say University of Georgia in particular has done some very, very powerful work in terms of thinking about big data and how that informs a student's pathway and trajectory, and how do we think about using all of the information that we have at our fingertips to really help students move along in their academic journey.
Great. Thank you. So we have a lot of questions coming in for you. So I'm going to do my best to everyone listening to try and merge questions that are similar together. So I'm sorry if I don't quite capture your whole question, but thank you for submitting them. Please do keep submitting them. They're getting sent to me. So let's see, to talk about a little bit about, I hinted at questions around the budget, the state's financial situation, a number of the things you focused on, the digital divide, the use of incentives to motivate higher ed, and then even just the coordinating entity, that would likely, as different from the Post-Secondary Ed Council, likely need its own staff, which costs money. I'm curious to understand, and so are the participants today, how do you think about advancing these types of systemic reforms in the midst of a budget crisis? And how do you, how do you make these decisions? I guess that's sort of a question more for Alonde, and then Peter, as a trustee, how do you make these decisions and advise your system? And then as CFO at the UC, and then as leading a national foundation, how do you advise across the US?
Well, I've been asked this question before, and one of the stories I like to tell is actually when I started at California Competes in 2011, we were in the midst or trying to recover from the state's Great Recession. And the question was, how do you affect change? How do you promote degree attainment when there's no money? And at the time, Governor Brown was governor, and he was particularly disciplined about not wanting to spend. That's the best way to say that. And so the question was, what could we do as an organization to really promote degree attainment when we know degree attainment costs money, and yet we also know that there is no money, disposable, money to be spent. And so it had us looking a lot at regulation. It had us looking a lot at what could be done at the institutional level in terms of reorienting and refocusing how institutions did their work. It had us looking at funding formulas. We looked at a whole vast number of things, many of which made a lot of people mad, but there were possibilities. So there are things that can be done. Now, I don't mean to suggest that everything will be the same for the next couple of years as we make our way through this recession, which is much deeper, as you mentioned at the top of the hour, than anything we were going through back 10 plus years ago, particularly when you look at the vast levels of unemployment. Our budget this year, our deficit was $54.3 billion. That was particularly painful because 7 months ago, when we went into the year, we thought we were going to have a surplus of almost $7 billion. So we have really had to do a complete turnaround. Where I do think we have opportunities is to the extent that there are stimulus dollars, and we are advocating very aggressively in Washington, D.C. for additional stimulus, particularly for states. Stimulus dollars will help to provide a cushion. The monies that will be used for the digital divide, we think that there are resources there through the $5.3 billion that the state allocated through the CARES Act that will go to K-12. So that can help with the digital divide. It can help with, online learning. It can help with professional development, all kinds of things that we expect our K-12 system to be able to leverage because of that. I think other things, people often ask, are we going to turn to philanthropy? I think, quite frankly, that many of the challenges that we face as a state are far too large to turn to philanthropy as a systemic solution. What we can do is think through, are there areas that we want to pilot particular types of programs where philanthropy might help us do that because we have a hunch or an idea that if we, and it could, for example, come out of this task force that we're going to begin in a few weeks. If we had something that we wanted to pilot, then potentially when the state had more resources again, when we were fully not in the red, but in the black, is there then an opportunity to be able to build in and scale some of those opportunities? I think, Peter mentioned the idea of funding and basing funding on goals. That has been a touchy subject, I guess I would say, here in California, as it has been across the nation. And so I think there's an open question as to whether performance-based funding is the way we want to go, and the kind of volatility that performance-based funding could enter or provide or pose for higher education institutions if we were to go in that direction, because there's so much about higher education finances that requires planning up front. And if your planning is really going to be, if your resources are really going to be based on meeting your goals, then that ability to plan over time is going to be much more challenging. So I think the question of performance-based funding, while I know my boss is a stickler for what are the metrics and how are we measuring and how do we know we've done well, it's a big policy question in higher education that I think warrants conversation, but is not easy by any stretch of the imagination.
It's a great point, Londe. Particularly in education, accountability is tough, trying to determine who's responsible for what. But culture change is something that is possible in higher education. Again, I think back 6-7 years ago when Governor Brown and Tim White first started to say, hey, CSU's graduation rates simply are unacceptable. And to me, as a recovering research university snob coming from the University of California, where we had probably the best graduation rates amongst all public universities in the country, I got to CSU and I was shocked. What is it that allows a system to say, hey, single-digit four-year graduation rates are okay? They're not okay. That's an embarrassment. And it requires a re-examination of how we deliver what we deliver with the types of students we have. And I'm very proud of what CSU has done in a very short period of time, 5 years or less, to reorient the culture. Faculty, staff, and administrators are really focused on trying to change the trajectory to improve outcomes for students of color. What you mentioned about philanthropy, I agree. I've worked in government. I was a staff person in Sacramento, my first job out of college. Government does a lot of things well. They don't always take a risk well because it's hard. Take a risk, it might not work out. And then somebody sticks a microphone in front of your face and says, how dare you waste public dollars? That's where philanthropy can come in, right? I don't have to stand for election. I don't have quarterly shareholder reports. And so we can afford to take risk on behalf of policymakers to see if ideas that seem creative, seem to have potential will work. I will put in a plug for re-examination of shared services. This is something I did as CFO. Not every campus, not every department on every campus has to have their own IT person, their own HR person, their own finance person. Nowadays, with modern technology, you can share a lot of those services. The UC has put in place shared services for HR and payroll, a new system based down in Riverside that all campuses use. I think it ought to be looked to as a model for how you might leverage those resources, skinny down the money spent on the back office to be able to repurpose money into teaching and research, which is frankly why we're all involved in this space.
Thank you. I'm going to try to combine a couple questions again. So we have about 10 minutes left. So we had a question from someone in the Inland Empire. Educational attainment is very low and poverty level is high. We have the challenge of increasing the college going rate and their capacity issues. How do we rectify the problem of access? And I'll broaden that, but there are a number of regions in California, as you're well aware, that have limited access to public universities, that whether it's there's not one in the region or those in the region are impacted. And another comment had mentioned that the adult intent to enroll is high, but adult enrollment is low. And this is something that Londe, you'd worked at California Competes, that, you know, adults in college, no degree. So in thinking about these questions around access, how do we build access for regions in the state where there isn't post-secondary, where there's not post-secondary institutions? And I also want to flag the RP group came out with a report recently around transfer, finding, Peter, you mentioned transfer being one of the big issues, finding that students that had completed requirements for transfer not transferring because they were too far from an institution to which they could transfer. So that distance barrier is a huge one. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. How do we address that issue?
Well, I think commonly, you know, people start turning initially to distance learning and what are the opportunities with online learning. And I do think that that is going to be a part of the solution, but I don't think it will be the full solution for anyone. I think there's much more that we can do around online learning and online education. But I also think that we have been assuming in some cases that online education is at parity with face-to-face education. There's nothing inherently positive about face-to-face education, and there's nothing inherently positive about online education, but we have to be intentional about quality in both spaces. And so to me, part of the answer is really thinking through what does that mean to think about quality for both online education and kind of brick and mortar education. And it's something that I've been talking with, you know, different people about, including, you know, quite frankly, I hope that our accreditors are able to think about this as we continue to really see the proliferation of online. I don't know that, as you know, recently there was a capacity report that came out through the CSU that capacity report was looking at what would it take and is there demand to build another CSU in different regions of the state. When you look at longer term projections, it doesn't look like that demand exists. And we have at least 5 regions of the state that would love to have a CSU. So some of that is some of that is around the actual need for education for those students. Other pieces are around CSUs as part of an economic development strategy. Some of it is to mitigate things like the incredible amount of time that people spend in their cars and trying to reduce traffic and other kinds of social ills. So we really need to think much more carefully about what education can look like, what hybrid education means, what blended models mean. How can we think about this in ways that are really outside of the box and outside of ways I think that we have traditionally thought about?
All I can say is I completely agree. Hybrid, blended is a lot more, I think, efficient and can be effective vis-a-vis that report Londe referenced. Even for a campus, you know, a satellite, not a full-blown new campus, but a satellite was a $1.9 billion to $2 billion construction cost. At a time like this, that's pretty tough. And I will tell you from my experience when I was CFO for the UC, where I started about the time that UC Merced was getting going, not crazy about the idea of building it and bailing on it or starting it and starving it. The fact of the matter is, if you're going to focus on that kind of a strategy, you really need to be committed to very long-term funding for it as well. And I'm just not sure the state has that. So the blended hybrid approach that Dr. Jose mentioned really makes most sense, I think, in the near term.
Great. Thank you. And I think we have time for, I'm going to push it with one more question. So another question that came through relates to both of your earlier points about a focus around degree completion in addition to access. What role do you see for credit for prior learning and competency-based ed in accelerating time to completion and improving access for the non-traditional students that Peter had highlighted as being a population that is growing and needs more attention?
Did one of my staff submit that question, Sujan?
I don't know.
It just so happens we're taking to our board of directors next week a grant with an education organization to try to develop a better framework for prior learning assessments. So people, who spend 10 years in the military working on computers come in to decide they want to major in computer technology. There ought to be some acknowledgement of the fact that they have some experience and knowledge of the space instead of saying, hey, you get to start from ground zero. And so more to come on that, assuming my board votes in favor of this next week. We hope to play a role at our foundation in trying to bring some highlighted conversation to what I think would be very valuable for the adult learner.
Yeah, I think that is great. The only thing I would add is that my guess is that given the economic dislocation that we are currently experiencing, we probably have many, many, many more people who have more experience than and are interested in pursuing higher education than we had 6 months ago. And so I actually think it is incredibly timely to be thinking about strategies like credit for prior learning, because we have so many people who will turn to our higher education system in a moment of crisis to try and sharpen their skills, to try and get a degree, to try and figure out what their path forward is. And we cannot be in a place where we're denying that kind of access and opportunity to people who have just vast amounts of experience and skills. So I think it's really timely, and I'm really happy to see folks like Peter are really trying to take charge of figuring out what is it that we can do and how do we think about scaling something like that in the state.
Great. And then how do you feel about I'm squeezing in yet another question. There's another question on what are your thoughts, or where do you stand on skill attainment rather than degree attainment? So in thinking about, both of you led comments in the beginning related to like rethinking about sort of what outcomes we value, how we think about our pathways. What about the skill building without the credential, I think is the question.
What about the skill building without the credential? Well, here's what where do I fall? Where I personally fall, which may be different from the administration, but here's where I fall. I think that for many groups in these United States, degrees really still matter. That they matter not just to help you get a job, but they are in fact, in many cases, a labor market signal with employers about what you know, about your ability to complete something rigorous, about some skills, about some cultural competency. Like, it is actually a labor market signal, oftentimes, the degrees that we hold. And until that fundamentally changes, while I think skills are important, I would always much rather see skills linked to some kind of credential that can go with it, because those signals still become the currency for many of our employers in terms of actually having some kind of opportunities, career opportunities in the labor market.
Yeah, I would agree, Londe. I was pretty excited a few years ago when the whole concept of boot camps came out and people were kind of doing intensive learning and then getting great jobs paying 70 and 90 grand. We have funded a fair amount of research to try to ascertain, does that learning in that kind of a setting really lead to long-term outcomes that benefit the student or the adult in terms of earning a family sustaining wage. And it's increasingly clear that credentialed programs, those that are credit bearing, really make a difference. And so our support is really very much focused on credit bearing programs, 1 year, 2 year, 4 year, what have you, in part because of the labor market signals and just because the evidence shows that the learning is more long lasting.
That's right. And the learning is long lasting, and what one of the goals that we have is for the overall well-being, the economic well-being, the social well-being, the educational well-being of all of the people who enter higher education, no matter where they enter. And so I want to make sure that they don't just leave with the opportunity to get a job, but they leave with the opportunity to live a life. And some of that is about what your livelihood is. And so I really think that it's important to be linking those two things and not get caught up, because a lot of times we get caught up in this false dichotomy of, you'll hear professors say, you're just trying to be a factory for, the business sector. No, I want to make sure that people have agency over their life. That's in my mind, the purpose of higher education.
Great. Well, thank you. I pushed us to 2 o'clock, so thank you for allowing us to squeeze a few more questions. Thank you, the participants, for submitting these great questions. And I also want to take a moment just to thank those who made this webinar possible. Our funders, of course, ECMC Foundation and the Gilbert Foundation for their investment on this specific project, along with College Futures, the Gates Foundation, Irvine Foundation, and Lumina. All of our dozens of external reviewers who reviewed many, many aspects of the dashboard, the report, the fact sheets. Thank you very much. All errors are our own. And of course, the California Competes team and our fabulous and highly engaged Leadership Council. So it is still 2, so we wrapped up in time. Thank you guys so much again for joining us. It was a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Take care.
Thanks.